A love built on trust. I first met Daniel and Emily at a small cafe on the corner of Maple Street. It was the kind of place where people came to linger over their coffee, lost in the hum of conversations and the scent of fresh pastries. I was a regular there, using the quiet atmosphere to get some work done. But over the years, I had come to recognize the familiar faces that frequented the shop. And Daniel and Emily. They were a couple you couldn't ignore. Daniel was the kind of man who wore his heart on his sleeve, a romantic at his core, always leaning in when Emily spoke, as if her words were the most important thing in the world. Emily, on the other hand, had an air of mystery about her, graceful, soft-spoken, with eyes that carried an unspoken weight. They seemed perfect together, the kind of couple that made you believe in soulmates. I would watch them, unknowingly at first, then with a quiet curiosity that turned into admiration. Their love was effortless, at least that's how it seemed. I remember watching Daniel surprise Emily with small, thoughtful gestures. A favorite book, a handwritten note slipped under her coffee cup, a stolen kiss on the forehead when he thought no one was looking. And Emily, well, she had a way of looking at him that made it clear he was her world. I don't know why I felt drawn to their story, but I suppose that's the thing about love. You can't help but be captivated by it when it's real. But as I would later learn, love is also layered in complexity, woven together with secrets, sacrifices, and truths that can shake even the strongest foundations. The truth about Emily was something no one, especially Daniel, could have ever anticipated. Daniel and Emily had been married for 10 years, a full decade of laughter, shared dreams, and the quiet comfort that comes with knowing someone inside out. Or so Daniel had believed. When they first met, Emily was everything he had ever wanted in a partner, kind, understanding, and above all, his best friend. They had a love that seemed unshakable, the kind that had endured the tests of time, career changes, financial struggles, and the everyday ups and downs of life. Their friends often joked that Daniel had hit the jackpot. "She's one in a million," they would say, and he would smile, knowing they were right. But what no one knew, what even Daniel himself didn't know, was that Emily carried a secret so profound, so deeply rooted in her past, that revealing it could change everything. She had been born as a man. Her name at birth had been Ethan. Emily had known she was different from a young age. She had always felt out of place in her body, trapped in a form that didn't match the person she was inside. Growing up, she had faced the confusion, the fear, and the overwhelming loneliness that came with not fitting into the mold society had expected of her. By the time she was in her 20s, she had made the decision to transition. It wasn't easy. Nothing about it was easy. The treatments, the surgeries, the emotional toll, the loss of people she had once called family. It was a journey paved with pain and resilience. But through it all, she had never regretted choosing to live as her true self. When she met Daniel, she had already built a new life. She had left behind her past, not out of shame, but out of the deep fear that the world was not ready to accept her truth. And when love found her in the form of a man who treated her with nothing but kindness, she had made a decision. She wouldn't tell them. It wasn't because she wanted to deceive him. No, it was because she loved him, so deeply, so wholly, that she feared losing him more than anything else. And so, she buried the past. For 10 years, she had lived with the constant worry of what would happen if Daniel ever found out. Would he still see her as the woman he had vowed to spend his life with? Or would everything they had built crumble in an instant? It wasn't until a fateful day, one that neither of them saw coming, that the truth finally came to light. It started with a letter. A single, misplaced letter from an old friend. Someone from Emily's past who had somehow found her address. Daniel had been the one to pick up the mail that day, and when he saw the name on the envelope, something didn't sit right. Curiosity turned into a quiet unease. He hesitated before opening it. After all, he trusted Emily. But something inside him, an instinct he couldn't shake, compelled him to unfold the letter and read the words written inside. And in that moment, his world shifted. The letter spoke of memories he knew nothing about, of a life Emily had never shared with him, a name he had never heard before, Ethan. His hands trembled as he read the words again, as if the meaning might change if he looked at them long enough. His mind raced with questions, but there was one that drowned out all the others. Who was his wife? That evening, when Emily walked through the front door, she could tell something was wrong. The air in the room had shifted, heavy with an unspoken tension. Daniel stood there, the letter clutched in his hand, his expression unreadable. Who is Ethan? His voice was quiet, but there was something raw in it, something that sent a chill down Emily's spine. For a moment, she couldn't speak. The world around her seemed to blur, and all she could hear was the sound of her own heartbeat, hammering against her ribs. She had always known this day might come. And now, standing before the man she loved, she realized that no amount of preparation could have ever readied her for it. This was it, the moment that would decide everything. The truth between us. The air in the room felt heavier than usual. It wasn't the kind of heaviness that came from exhaustion or stress. It was the weight of something far greater, a shift, a collision of past and present, an unraveling of the life they had built together. Emily stood in the doorway, frozen, as she stared at Daniel. His fingers gripped the edges of the letter so tightly that the paper had begun to crumple. The name she had buried for so long, was staring back at her from the page like a ghost resurrected. Ethan. It wasn't just a name. It was a life, a history, a version of herself she had once been forced to live before finally stepping into who she was meant to be. And now, after years of carefully protecting that truth, it had surfaced in the most terrifying way possible. Daniel's eyes burned with questions, but there was something deeper in his gaze, something she couldn't quite place. Betrayal, confusion, anguish. She took a step forward, her pulse pounding so loudly she could barely hear her own breath. Daniel. Her voice was barely a whisper. Who is Ethan? He interrupted, his voice sharper this time, but not angry. Just desperate. Emily had prepared for this moment in her mind countless times. She had rehearsed explanations, imagined ways she could soften the blow if the truth ever came out. But now, faced with the reality of it, she realized something devastating. No amount of planning could make this easier. For the first time in their 10-year marriage, she saw a kind of distance in Daniel's eyes, as if she were suddenly a stranger standing in their home. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. I don't understand, Daniel continued, his voice quieter now, yet each word carried the weight of an earthquake. I know you. I know everything about you. I know what kind of coffee you drink, how you can't sleep without the sound of rain playing in the background, how you always leave the last bite of your meal, no matter how hungry you are. He let out a breath, shaking his head as if trying to wake up from a bad dream. So why don't I know this? Emily swallowed the lump in her throat. Because I was afraid. Daniel's expression hardened slightly, though not in anger. Afraid of what? That you would leave. Silence. It was the kind of silence that stretched across time, filling every space between them. Daniel lowered himself onto the couch, as if his legs could no longer support the weight of what he had just learned. Emily remained standing, watching him, her hands trembling at her sides. Please, she whispered. Let me explain. He rubbed his temple, exhaling slowly before nodding. Okay. Explain. Emily took a deep breath, forcing herself to meet his eyes. I was born as Ethan, she admitted, her voice steady despite the whirlwind inside her. But I was never Ethan. I was always Emily. I just didn't have the words for it back then. Daniel flinched slightly, but he didn't speak. He was listening. I knew I was different from the moment I was old enough to understand myself, she continued. I didn't fit into the body I was given, but I had no idea how to fix it. My childhood was lonely. I spent years pretending, years being someone I wasn't. And when I was finally old enough to do something about it, I did. I left everything behind. I went through the treatments, the surgeries, the therapy, the heartbreak. I lost people. But I also found myself. She paused, her voice trembling. By the time I met you, I had already been living as Emily for years. I was happy, truly happy for the first time in my life. And then I met you. And suddenly, I had everything I had ever wanted. A love I never thought I would have. Daniel stared at her, unblinking. So why didn't you tell me? A tear slipped down her cheek. Because I was afraid that if you knew, you'd stop seeing me as your wife, as the woman you fell in love with. That you would only see the past, the version of me that I fought so hard to leave behind. Daniel clenched his jaw, his hands tightening into fists on his knees. Do you trust me so little? No, Emily said quickly, shaking her head. It's not that. It's just, I know how the world can be, how people can be. I've spent my entire life fighting to be seen for who I am. I didn't want to risk losing the one person who made me feel safe. Daniel exhaled, rubbing his face with both hands. He was struggling, trying to process everything at once, and Emily could see the conflict in his eyes. I need to think, he murmured after a long pause. The word sent a sharp pain through her chest, but she understood. How could she expect him to accept something so big in a matter of minutes? Take all the time you need, she whispered. Without another word, Daniel stood up and walked past her, grabbing his coat on the way out the door. The moment it closed behind him, Emily felt her legs give out, and she collapsed onto the floor, burying her face in her hands. For the first time in years, she let herself cry. Daniel's long walk. Outside, the world continued as if nothing had changed. The streets were alive with people laughing, couples holding hands, the scent of fresh bread wafting from the nearby bakery. It all felt surreal. Daniel walked without a destination, his thoughts racing faster than his steps. He replayed every moment of the last 10 years, searching for clues, for signs. Had he ever questioned Emily's past? Had she ever hinted at this? No, she had simply been his Emily, his wife, his best friend. And yet now, everything felt different. He wasn't angry. That was the strange part. He had expected to feel betrayal, to feel like his trust had been shattered, but instead, he only felt lost. He thought back to their wedding day, to the way she had looked at him when she said, "I do." That was real. The way she had comforted him during his worst moments, how she had made him laugh, how she had loved him without hesitation. That was real too. So why did it feel like he was losing her? After what felt like hours, Daniel found himself at the edge of the lake where he and Emily had once spent an entire summer afternoon skipping rocks and talking about their future. He sat on a bench, staring at the rippling water. Did it matter? Did it really change anything? She was still the woman he had loved for a decade. She was still the person who had been there through everything. The only thing that had changed was his perspective. Daniel sighed and ran a hand through his hair. Could he look past the years of secrecy? Could he accept that the woman he loved had once been someone else, even if she had always been Emily inside? The answer didn't come right away. But deep down, Daniel knew one thing for certain. He couldn't imagine his life without her, the choice that defines us. There are moments in life when time slows down, not because the world around you has changed, but because something within you has shifted. The ground beneath you no longer feels stable, the air around you feels different, and suddenly, you realize that nothing will ever be the same again. Daniel sat by the lake, staring at the water as it rippled under the soft glow of the streetlights. The world was quiet here, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside his mind. How do you make sense of something like this? How do you reconcile 10 years of love with a truth that rewrites the foundation of your marriage? A part of him wanted to be angry. He wanted to scream, to demand why she had kept this from him, why she had let him believe a version of their story that was incomplete. But another part of him, The part that had held her while she cried. The part that knew her favorite lullaby. The part that had memorized the way her nose scrunched when she laughed. Couldn't find it in himself to be angry. Because the truth was, he still loved her. That realization hit him harder than anything else. Love doesn't just disappear because of new information. Love doesn't dissolve because of shock. Love is a choice, and now Daniel stood at a crossroads where he had to decide. Would he let this truth overshadow everything they had built? Or would he choose to see Emily for who she had always been to him? He sighed, rubbing his face with both hands. He knew one thing for sure. He couldn't make this decision alone. And so, for the first time since walking out of their home, Daniel pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. The phone rang twice before a deep, familiar voice answered. "Danny." Daniel exhaled. "Hey, Dad. Can we talk?" A father's perspective. Daniel's father, Richard, had always been a man of few words. He was the type to fix a leaky pipe himself instead of calling a plumber. The type to sit in silence for hours fishing, not because he wanted to catch something, but because he enjoyed the stillness of the moment. Growing up, Daniel had always admired his father's quiet strength, but there was one thing they had never done much of, talking about feelings. That was why calling him now, of all people, felt like an odd choice. But maybe, deep down, Daniel knew he needed to hear the voice of someone who had been married for decades, someone who had seen love in its rawest, most difficult forms. Richard didn't ask questions. He simply told Daniel to come over. By the time Daniel arrived, his father was sitting on the porch with 2 cups of coffee, one already waiting for him. Daniel sat down with a heavy sigh, wrapping his hands around the warm cup. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The cicadas hummed in the background, the distant sound of crickets filling the night air. Finally, Richard broke the silence. "Something on your mind?" Daniel let out a dry laugh. "That obvious, huh?" His father didn't smile, didn't even look at him. He just took a slow sip of coffee and said, "You only call me when you're lost." Daniel nodded, his gaze fixed on the wooden planks of the porch. "I don't even know where to start." "Start anywhere." And so, Daniel did. He told his father everything. About Emily. About Ethan. About the 10 years of marriage built on a truth he had never known. He spoke of his love for her, his confusion, his fears. He laid everything bare, expecting his father to react with shock, maybe even disapproval. But Richard just listened. When Daniel finally finished, silence settled between them once more. Then his father sighed. "Son, let me ask you something. When you think about Emily, the way she makes you feel, the life you've built, does that change because of what you found out?" Daniel hesitated. "I don't know." "Do you love her?" That question alone made his chest tighten. He stopped, swallowing hard. "Yes, I do." His father nodded as if he had expected that answer. "Then you've got to decide what matters more, the person you've known and loved for a decade, or the past you never knew about." Daniel frowned. "But she lied to me." Richard shook his head. "No, she protected herself. There's a difference." Daniel looked up, startled. His father had always been a straightforward man, not the type to entertain nuances. You think she did the right thing." Richard let out a slow breath. "I think she did what she felt she had to do. And maybe, if the world weren't so cruel, she wouldn't have had to." He turned to Daniel, meeting his eyes for the first time. "Son, love isn't about never having secrets. It's about what you do once the secrets are out." Daniel felt something in his chest crack open. He had been so focused on the deception, on the shock, that he hadn't stopped to think about what this meant for Emily. How afraid must she have been all these years? How much had she sacrificed just to feel safe? And how much had she loved him to risk everything for the life they had? Richard patted his son's shoulder. "You've got a good heart, Danny. Don't let pride get in the way of what you know is right." Daniel exhaled, feeling the weight of the night settle over him. He had his answer. Coming home. It was nearly midnight when Daniel pulled into their driveway. The house was dark except for the faint glow of the living room lamp. He stepped inside quietly, his heart pounding. Emily was curled up on the couch, her arms wrapped around herself as if trying to hold herself together. She looked up as the door clicked shut. Her face was streaked with dried tears, and the moment their eyes met, fresh ones welled up. "I thought," her voice broke, "I thought you weren't coming back." Daniel swallowed hard, crossing the room in a few strides. He knelt in front of her, taking her shaking hands in his. "I had to think," he admitted softly. Emily closed her eyes, nodding as if bracing herself for what was coming. Daniel took a deep breath. "I'm not going to pretend this isn't a shock. I'm not going to say I understand everything right now. But what I do know is that I love you, and I'm not willing to throw away 10 years because of something you feared telling me." Emily let out a broken sob, her hands tightening around his. "I never wanted to lie to you. I know." He reached up, brushing a tear from her cheek. "And I'm sorry you ever felt like you had to." Emily looked at him with so much raw emotion that it nearly stole his breath. "So, what now?" Daniel smiled, a small, tired smile, but a real one. "Now," he said, "we figure this out. Together." And in that moment, the weight of the world lifted just a little. Love, after all, wasn't about perfection. It was about choosing each other every single day. And Daniel knew, without a doubt, that he would always choose her, rebuilding the foundation. In the days that followed, Daniel and Emily lived in a fragile space between what was and what could be. The house felt different, not because anything had physically changed, but because they both carried a quiet understanding that the life they had built was now under reconstruction. Daniel had always believed that love was simple. You find someone, you build a life together, and you grow old side by side. He had never thought about what it meant to love someone through the weight of secrets, through the unraveling of truth, through the reshaping of identities. Emily, for the first time in years, lived without the crushing fear of discovery. And yet, freedom didn't come without its own set of worries. Now that Daniel knew, now that her truth was fully exposed, what did their future look like? They spent long nights talking. Some conversations were quiet, filled with long silences where they simply held each other, letting their bodies speak the words they didn't know how to say. Other nights were harder, filled with questions, hesitations, and the painful process of untangling emotions too complex to sort through in one sitting. Daniel learned things about Emily he had never known before. Things she had never dared to share, the battles she had fought alone, the friendships lost, the family members who had turned away when she had chosen herself. And Emily, in turn, learned things about Daniel too. His fears, his doubts, the way he wrestled with the idea that he had unknowingly been blind to something so huge, and how that made him question his own sense of reality. But through it all, one thing remained constant. They chose each other every single day. And that was enough. Love's final test. One evening, months after the truth had first unraveled between them, Daniel and Emily found themselves back at the lake. It was where he had gone the night he had first left their home. And now, it was where they sat together, side by side, hands intertwined, staring at the reflection of the sky in the water. Emily turned to him, searching his face. "Do you ever think about how different things might have been if I had told you from the start?" Daniel thought about it. He had asked himself the same question more times than he could count. And then he shook his head. "If you had told me then, I don't know if I would have understood." He turned to her, meeting her gaze. "But I understand now, and I know that who you are today is all that has ever mattered to me." Emily swallowed hard, her eyes glistening. "You really mean that?" Daniel smiled. Every word. A tear slipped down her cheek. But this time, it wasn't out of fear or sadness. It was something else. Something lighter. Something freeing. She squeezed his hand. "I love you." Daniel leaned in, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead. "And I love you. Always." The wind moved through the trees, carrying away the last remnants of doubt, of hesitation, of the weight they had once carried between them. For the first time in a long time, they sat together without walls, without secrets, without fear. And in that quiet, infinite moment, they knew this love had been real from the very start. And nothing could ever change that.